Gen i groesawu pawb sydd yma heno yn Llyfrgell Genedlaethol Cymru a rhai sydd yn ymuno â ni o bell ac o agos ar-lein. Blaser andibat a gawr arachaldean galesko liburutegi nacionalera ongi etoria ematea, ongi etori sarean saudeten gustioi eta hemen gaudenoi. Jaione Diaz Mazquiaran is the Alan R. King Etchepare Chair in Sociolinguistics for 2025 here at the University of Wales Centre for Advanced Welsh and Celtic Studies. Da ni'n falch iawn bob blwyddyn o fod yn cael croesawu athro preswyl i gofnodi'r partneriaeth sydd rhyngtho ni a sefydliad Etchepare Gwlad y Basg a phwysigrwydd i ni fel canolfan bod ni'n estyn allan I groesawu ymchwilwyr gwadd ato ni. We're very grateful to the Etchepare Basque Institute for supporting this visiting chair. And it's very important for us here in Wales to make those connections with the Basque country in particular, especially in the field of sociolinguistics. And so we're really pleased that our university, if you like, was chosen as the designated chair in sociolinguistics. Ac mae hi hefyd wrth gwrs yn briodol iawn I ni yma yn Nhref Aberystwyth yn bod ni wedi enwi'r gadar ar ôl Alan King, un a gyfrannodd yn sylweddol iawn at ymwybyddiaeth o'r iaith Basgeg yma yn ein cymuned ni, ac un a gyfrannodd yn sylweddol iawn at ddatblygiad yr iaith Basgeg mewn sawl maes. So we've always been really pleased to have been able to name the chair after, in honour of Alan King, the late Alan King. He lived with us for many years and he made a big contribution to the knowledge that we have today of the sociolinguistics of the Basque country. He also welcomed many people, many delegations from Wales to the Basque country, along with Bigotio Olaisola, who is online, Kaisio Bigotio. And so his contribution here in Wales, as well as his contribution in the Basque country, is something that we are honoured to be able to associate with this opportunity. Jaione Diaz Mazquiaran was born and raised in the Basque country and has extensive international experience. She completed her undergraduate studies in English philology at the University of Salamanca and spent a year as an Erasmus scholar at the University of Edinburgh. She completed 2 master's degrees in the United States, the first in bilingual education at Illinois State University and the second in intercultural communication at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and was a Fulbright scholar for that period. She completed her PhD in education at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. Now, as a future line of research, her goal is to explore ways to leverage the linguistic identities and practices of migrant students in multilingual contexts involving minoritized and regional languages while paying attention to ongoing language revitalization efforts. In addition, she hopes to bring her research closer to home in the future. But this term, it's our pleasure to host her as the Alan R. King Chair in Sociolinguistics. The title of her talk this evening is Language Beliefs and Belonging, the Experiences of Children from Migrant Families in Basque-Medium Education. Ongi etorri Jaione, zure da hitza.
Bueno, eskerrik asko, Elin, eta arratsaldeon guztioi. Plazer bata hemen egotea. Prynhawn da, mae'n bleser bod yma gyda chi gyd, diolch yn fawr iawn. So I want to first of all thank so much the University of Wales Centre for Advanced Welsh and Celtic Studies for having me here today and for welcoming me so warmly. And of course, the partnership between the University of Wales Trinity St. David and Etxepare Euskal Institutua for establishing this chair and giving me the opportunity to disseminate my work. And of course, I wanted to thank especially Elin Eskerrik asko Elin Diolch for believing in my project and believing in a, in a young scholar who is just starting with her academic career. So yeah, I'm here today to present my PhD thesis work, and hopefully you will find it interesting, and I will be very happy to receive all your comments and questions. So before starting my talk, I would like to share with you a poem, because apart from traveling and researching, I also like writing. And so I got inspired while I was running in the waterfront in Aberystwyth, the first afternoon that I was here. I tried having the translation in Welsh. Unfortunately, I'm not very good with Google Translate, and I couldn't trust Google Translate much, so apologies for that. By the way, I just took a 2-hour lesson of Welsh last week. My level is not there yet, but I promise you that before leaving Aberystwyth and before finishing my stay here, that I will be able to at least engage in a basic conversation, because it is really, I feel really honored and privileged to be able to learn your language and also learn about your rich cultural heritage. So here is the poem, and I'm going to read it if you let me, in Basque. Leiotik begira zeru goibel bat gaurkoan, eta bertan milaka txori egalari. Kostaldeko arroken aurka bortizki dabiltza olatuak, nahasmen horren erdian aritzen dira dantzari. Udazkena Aberystwythen dago hainbat koloretako mozorroarekin. Eta bien bitartean galdetzen diot nik iparaizeari. Nola egin dezakegu gure ikasle guztiek aukera izan dezaten, etorkizuneko hiztun bezala, harrotasunez arreta jartzeko beren familien jatorriari, beren nortasun zein usteak sutxuz defendatzeko eskubidearekin, eta konpromezu horretan egiteko toki euskarari. Euskaldunon sustraiak bermatzeko, baita funtsezkoa, jarraitzea bidea egiten gure hizkuntzaren erabilerari, eta bide batez eleaniztasunari. So this will be the outline for my presentation. I will talk about the sociolinguistic context where my research is based, and I will, after talking a little bit about the most recent literature review and works, I will delineate the research gap where my study fits. Afterwards, I will talk briefly about the conceptual framework and also the study design that I followed. And then I will talk about the research setting and present the participants in my study. Moving on, I will give a brief summary of the findings, followed by the main discussion points, and I will end the presentation with key implications addressing different stakeholders. And of course, I would like to end the presentation with those comments, questions, feedback that you might have, because I want this to be, of course, a conversation, and I would also like to learn from all of you. So let's talk a little bit about the background context. As you might know, the Basque Country comprises 3 different territories. We have Iparralde, the Basque Autonomous Community, and the Foral Community of Navarre. And as you can see in the map, that is where the research took place. Some of you might identify that hand that appears on the left-hand side of the presentation, and this is Irulegiko eskua. This was a bronze artifact found in 2021 at the Irulegiko archaeological site, and it had a very important inscription there written in Basque. This means that Basque has been used in Navarre and has been present in Navarre for many and many and many centuries. Moving on to the sociolinguistic situation nowadays, and as you can see in the map, the language competence of speakers varies depending on the territory. And if we look at the differences, you can perceive the differences between the Bac and Iparralde and Navarre. If we look more specifically, Navarre it can be divided into 3 different speaking zones. We have the Basque-speaking zone, the mixed zone, and the non-Basque-speaking zone. And again, the number and the percentage of speakers in each of the zones is quite relevant for the study. So, since my study focuses on students enrolled in primary education who have this migrant background, according to the Nafarroako Gobernua, in Navarre, the 20.6% of primary education students enrolled in public schools are of migrant origin. All these from these students, the majority of them come from Spanish-speaking countries, from both Latin and South America, followed by people coming from Morocco, Portugal, China, and Romania, according to Ikuspegi. If you look at the graphs here, and as you can see, in Navarre, the amount of the use of Basque is quite visible in the north of it. However, it is quite shocking to see that another language is used in the mixed zone and the non-Basque speaking zone. And the percentage of Basque usage in these zones is quite low. If we look on the other graph, the Basque language used in Navarre, generally, you can see that the percentage of languages which can be either Spanish or other languages is almost an 85%. So this talks a lot about the sociolinguistic situation in our territory. And people who use Basque more than other languages, it is just 4%, which tells a lot as well. So if we look now at the different educational models that exist in Navarre, and I will briefly explain them. So we have the D model, which is the Basque immersion model, where all the subjects are taught in Basque, and Spanish is taught as a language subject together with English. The B model, where 50% of the subjects are taught in Spanish, and the other 50% are taught in Basque. The A model, where Spanish is the main instructional language, and Basque is just taught as a language subject. And finally, the G model, where there is no presence of Basque in the instruction. So these graphs compare the situation between 2006 and 2021. And again, these are graphs taken from the 7th Sociolinguistic Survey. And as you can see, there has been a slight increase in the enrollments in the D model of instruction. And this is because families are currently encouraged to enroll their kids in this model of instruction. So especially, of course, in the Basque-speaking zone of Navarre. Families are realizing the social, functional, and integrative value that Basque has for their children and also for themselves. So they are becoming more motivated to send their kids to this model of instruction. If we look at the bigger graph on the left-hand side and the attitude towards Basque language promotion, as you can see, these attitudes are favorable, very favorable in the north of Navarre. However, the situation changes depending on the mixed zone, and the attitudes are not that favorable in the southern part of Navarre. So this leads me to explain the research gap where my study fits. As we all know, in multilingual contexts with a regional minority language, such as the Basque context, Catalonia, Wales, Irish, Scotland, the languages of immigrant students are not always considered to be as valuable as regional languages. Educational policies do respect and recognize the home languages of immigrant students. However, that acknowledgement is normally confined to the home or the community domain. In the Basque context, of course, and it is very it has to be like that, pedagogical practices of language separation in order to protect the minority language are still very relevant. However, recent research, such as the works conducted by Villar en la Sagabaster, Garciarena, Villabona and Olave, or Casitas Vicandi and Perales Fernandez de Gamboa, etc., show a shift from monolingual to more inclusive multilingual perspectives, with a growing attention placed on teachers' beliefs and practices in multilingual education and inclusive and diverse classrooms. Again, across European contexts, research has demonstrated that when teachers intentionally leverage a students' full linguistic repertoire and they use these languages as tools, pedagogical tools, learners experience an enhanced engagement and a deeper understanding of the content. And this has been proved in different contexts, such as the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Sweden. Some European schools and projects, for example, the Validiv project in the Flemish context, have started to include all these languages in and the students' home languages in the teaching practices, and the results are quite positive. Teachers value multilingualism, but their actual practices differ somehow from those favorable attitudes towards pupils' heritage languages. Their mother tongues are acknowledged, however, they are not regularly inserted in the class or even mentioned in the class, according to works such as the one by La Raza and Diaz de Quereño. Therefore, in the Basque context, the complex dynamics between parental aspirations to integrate the children, teachers' challenges when trying to balance the linguistic policies of the institutions and the classroom, the realities in the classroom, and finally, students' struggle whenever they have to navigate their multilingual linguistic identities remains unexplored. And that is where I decided to insert my research. Moreover, little is known about how migrant students, both Spanish and non-Spanish speakers, relate to Basque and the different languages in their multilingual repertoires. And I believe these insights are essential in order to leverage their full linguistic repertoire and enhance both their academic but also their social well-being. So I'm going to now move on to the conceptual framework of my study. So I decided I wanted to see the connection between three different aspects. First of all, the participants' language practices, so how they were using language. Secondly, I wanted to see how the different perceptions and expectations of participants were shaping those language practices. And finally, I also wanted to understand the impact that institutional structures had on those linguistic choices. So I was wondering, what can I use in order to explore this? Because in my mind, it was a very complex. At first, it looked too ambitious for me. However, and because I was convinced that these discourses intersected across scales and there needed to be some type of tool that helped me analyze this, I found out that nexus analysis could help me with it. So I created a qualitative case study based on ethnographic methods, and I used nexus analysis as the overarching analytical tool. Nexus analysis is a type of mediated discourse analysis, and I am going to explain briefly how it works. So there is always a mediated action in the middle, and in this case, those would be the model of instruction where these students were learning. And in every type of nexus, there are three forces combined. On the one hand, we would have the historical body of participants, and this refers to their background experiences and the socio-cultural historical context. So all the background that speakers bring to the picture. Secondly, we would have the discourses in place component of nexus analysis, and this refers to the language beliefs and expectations of speakers. Finally, we would have the third component, which is interaction order. This refers to the way speakers use language, and this is always mediated by the linguistic hierarchies taking place in that given context. So I tried putting everything together, and I used positioning theory, language ideologies, and translanguaging as conceptual lenses to inform these three components. And I hope this makes sense now. So these are the components of nexus analysis, the three research sub-questions that I used in order to guide the study, the conceptual lenses that I employed in order to get data and answer those questions, and finally, the data collection methods that I employed. As you can see, I conducted individual interviews with participants. I also engaged students in the creation of identity texts, and I will show you some examples later on. Identity texts refer to linguistic portraits, so they have an empty silhouette and they have to fill it with the languages they know, and then language maps as well. And finally, I conducted observations both inside the classroom and in the playground in order to understand how the students were using languages. So, putting everything together, the overarching research question of my study was: how are students' language practices in language and content area classrooms mediated by their perceptions of language and the expectations of parents and teachers? So now I'm going to talk about the research setting. In order to gather enough data, I recruited, or the study recruited, participants from 2 schools. These schools were located in the mixed zone of Navarre. These were rural schools, so they were quite small. One of them was Lorea Escola, and the other one was Mendia Escola. They were located in Arguia town and Erreka town. One of the schools was bigger, as you can see, and it offered the A and D model of instruction. The second school was smaller, and it just offered the Basque-Medium instruction. As you can see, the percentage of students with migrant background was quite relevant in both schools, and the students without Basque as home language was very visible in the bigger school, and it was lower in the smaller school. And I must mention that in the smaller town, Basque was much more present in the streets, and people were using it much more. It was much more audible. So, according to participants, there were 3 groups of participants. There were 16 students whose families came from different countries. These students were either born in the Basque country, or they were born in their families' respective countries, and then they had come to the Basque country. There were 15 families because 2 of the students were siblings, and finally 10 teachers from both schools, and these were both generalist and specialized teachers. This graph here shows the students' family country of origin. As you can see, most of the families came from Morocco, but there were other countries represented as well, such as Venezuela, Romania, Senegal, and Ecuador. And moving on to the second graph here, we have the parents' language background. So these were the languages that families were speaking at home. Most of them were speaking Arabic at home. There was a mix of Arabic and Spanish in some cases. The Senegalese families were just speaking Wolof at home. There was a mix of Spanish and Romanian in the case of the Romani student, and so on. So you have the list of the home languages there. So now, I am going to present the key findings of the study, and these are guided by the 3 research sub-questions that I presented earlier. So the first one, I wanted to know how students related to the languages they had in their multilingual linguistic repertoire. So the question was, how do pupils from migrant families in the Basque country relate to the languages in which they interact at home and at school? In order to gather data, I conducted interviews with the students, individual interviews, and I also complemented the interviews with the drawings and portraits that they had created. When I was transcribing and translating all the data, I realized that after doing thematic analysis, I could see that there were 3 main dimensions under which their perceptions fell. The first one was the ethnic affiliated dimension. So this is when students referred to as the language of belonging. They could see that there was that connection with their cultural background. The second most relevant dimension was what I coined the social dimension. So students were considering the language as a tool to integration. And finally, there was a third dimension, the functional dimension, where students perceived the language as a tool to success. This could be either academic success or getting opportunities in the future as well. Students' relationships with their languages were complex, multi-layered, and evolved over time. We know that this is just at a given moment and a space, and this means that their perceptions can evolve and change over time. There were different degrees of emotional attachment linked to the languages they knew. And students also showed a variety of predisposition towards the languages they knew and spoke. So here, as we can see, most of the students conceived their home language as a link to their cultural background, to the family background. It gave them that sense of belonging and group membership. This is interesting because the relationship towards Basque was different, depending on whether students' home language was Spanish or it was a language different from Spanish. So the students with no Spanish as their home language showed a deeper connection towards Basque. They could perceive Basque as a tool to socialize and to make local friends. For them, it was a very important language. As for students with Spanish as the home language, however, Basque was just a mere functional tool. They saw it as a as a need to pass the exams and get good grades. Their perception showed a kind of tension whenever they talked about Basque, and I will explain this later on. Most of the students saw Spanish as a social, under the social dimension. They could see that Spanish was a good tool to communicate in the town, and they could also engage in language brokering. This means helping their parents translate. So, for example, if they received a letter from the school or they received a letter from the doctor's appointment, they could translate for their parents, and they were using mostly Spanish. And finally, English was seen as a functional, under the functional dimension. They could see it as a language that opened opportunities and gave them the opportunity as well to travel internationally, etc. So now, I have brought here, and I'm sorry because it is quite blurry, but I hope you can see something. So this, I have brought here the identity text created by 2 students. These were created by Raed. Raed was a student born and raised in the Basque Country, but his family came from Morocco. He was 9 years old, and this is what he created. So as we can see, he placed Arabiera and Euskera, so Arabic and Basque, in his heart. He placed English in his mind, and Spanish somewhere in his arm. So this can give you... Yes, that was my... in the arm, okay, interesting. So this can give you a sense of how the child was... the predisposition that the child had towards these languages, and also the emotional attachment that he felt towards them. If we look at his language map, it is interesting that the student compartmentalized all the languages. So he divided the languages according to when he was using them and where he was using them. So everything is written in Basque, and I'm going to translate it. So he wrote using Spanish on the street to speak with people. He wrote using Arabic at home and also in Morocco every time he was back. He wrote using Basque in the school and also in the park. And finally, he wrote using English whenever he traveled because he wanted to meet new people. And these are his words. I'm going to read it from here. Sorry. I love Arabic and Basque. I love them, and they are very important to me. My background roots are Moroccan, but I was born here, so I would identify as Moroccan who was born in the Basque Country. Back in Morocco, we also spoke Berber, which is like the Basque of Morocco. But here, in the Basque Country, we speak Euskera, and I really like it. You cannot believe it. You cannot believe my face, my eyes were wide open, when a 9-year-old child was able to make that connection between the sociolinguistic situation of Basque and the sociolinguistic situation of Berber in Morocco. For me, it gives me chills. Anyway, yes. So, anyway, that was Raed's words. These are Raed's words. Moving on, here we have a second case. So this portrait and map were created by Benjamin. He was a 9-year-old student, also enrolled in a D model. His family came from Ecuador. However, he was also born in Basque Country. As you can see, he places Euskera in his head, Spanish in his mouth, and English somewhere in his lower body. Let's move on. If we look at his language map, again, he wrote everything in Basque, so I'm going to give a summary. He wrote using Spanish in every single place except for the school, where he wrote using Basque at school and also at music lessons because he played the guitar in the afternoons. So, as you can see, his reality was very Spanish speaking. And these are his words. I always speak Spanish outside school. Basque is very difficult for me, and I don't understand it much, and I can't explain things. I need to know more Basque, also because my mother says that no one would understand me, and I would not succeed in school if I don't speak Basque here. So a very different perception and perspectives towards Basque, but we will talk about this later on. Let's move on now to the second research question. Here I wanted to analyze what the language beliefs of parents and teachers were, and my aim was to not just take them separately. I wanted to see the connections, if there was any similarities or differences between these two groups of participants and their beliefs and expectations. So the guiding research question was, how do parents and teachers' language expectations relate to the ways in which immigrant students use languages at school, and do these align? Based on this, again, I conducted thematic analysis based on the interviews and the data retrieved from them, and I used a language ideologies framework, which was based on Reese's language orientations, and also Lobianco's and de Jong's more recent language ideologies framework. Based on this, there were 3 dimensions that I used as guiding themes to code data. The first one was language protection. With this ideology, there was a threat perceived and a need to protect the language, because the language was seen as both a right and also a cultural and identity marker. Looking at the second type of ideology, language integration is based on the idea that language is a social resource that is needed in order to integrate in a given context. And finally, with a pro-multilingualism ideology, I could see that participants were perceiving languages as both intelligence and economic resources. So, having those 3 key ideologies as the base, these are the key findings regarding parents. So in their words, I could see that language ideologies were very context-dependent, and there were some differences spotted depending on whether Basque or Spanish were at play. Among parents, a common pro-multilingualism ideology was found. Parents believed languages were tools for success for their children. There was a higher allowance of language flexibility in some of the cases, especially in the Moroccan families, and this, I believe, has a reason behind that. There is a reason behind that. Most of the participating Moroccan families were coming from Morocco to the Basque Country, and their children had either had some education back in Morocco, so they already had a quite high level of Arabic, or in other cases, these children were attending a weekend lesson in Arabic in the town, because these towns offered those services for the students. And that is why these parents were not feeling a threat in regards to home language maintenance. They couldn't see that threat. But this situation was different for the Senegalese families because, of course, Wolof was not present in the towns. So for these families, it was essential to protect the use of Wolof at home. And that is why they followed a very strict home language management at home. They allowed their kids, they wanted their kids to speak in Wolof, and they also allowed Basque at home. But there was no instance of Spanish allowance at home, because Spanish was a threat for them. Also, looking at more results, there was a high expectations for the children's academic performance found among parents' words. However, there was a low involvement of them at the school. And now I'm going to show you 3 excerpts from interviews. So this one was conducted with a father from Senegal, and these were his words. I oblige my kids to read in Basque 20 to 30 minutes every day. I can't help with it, but they know they have to read it for class. I was advised by their tutors, and I think it is important for them apart from speaking Wolof. I like that they are learning Basque. It is another language, but I don't allow Spanish at home. So again, that threat is perceivable there. Moving on to the second quotation, this was from Ari's mother, who came from Ecuador, and these are her words. I think there is a lot of marginalization. Kids who have Basque in the household have that advantage, but all the kids should have the same opportunities. The language benefit local kids have is very big and unfair. So these are, I'm just putting it here so we can have some thoughts afterwards if you want. And this is the last quotation from a Moroccan father who said, we are happy here and we want them to also be exposed to the languages people speak here, not just Arabic. Moroccan kids in Mendia Escola don't speak Spanish or Arabic, they speak Basque. I don't want my daughter to forget the languages from here. We only go to Morocco every 2 or 3 years and stay for 20 days, because if it is longer, they might forget Basque. So again, very insightful quotations. Let's move on now to teachers' beliefs. So among teachers, there was that protective belief, very visible belief towards Basque. They were teaching in the D model of instruction, and they believed that the classroom was the space where kids needed to not only know, but also use the language. They were also advocating at the same time pro-multilingual beliefs, claiming not to be discriminatory. They believed that multilingualism was natural and enriching for their students. Most of the teachers were valuing communication over linguistic purity, especially during content lessons. They believed it was more important for these kids to participate, even though the participation was not completely correct. So this could reveal some tensions between the policy adherence and at the same time the reality in a classroom. Among teachers' perspectives, there was no mention of pedagogical translanguaging. However, they were requesting for more training in order to apply multilingual pedagogies. And these are some views from teachers. So with here, a generalized teacher said, I don't know their mother tongue, this student's mother tongue. If there is another student who knows their mother tongue, let's say Arabic in class, they can rely too much on it, and that can be risky as they might not acquire Basque properly. Maybe there is a bridge language, English, helping communication between us. However, the right thing in the D model is to use Basque. A second generalized teacher, Iker, said, these students are left behind and the school doesn't know either how to act sometimes. They don't provide us with much help from the institutional level concerning good multilingual practices. If we had guidelines on how to properly immerse these students and their linguistic and cultural baggage, so again, there was a call there for more training. And finally, this was an English teacher, Maite, who said, it is hard when immigrant students arrive with no language knowledge. I prioritize the development of oral skills, and I always ask, in English or Basque? So she allows translation between the two languages. But again, Spanish is not allowed in class. So now, let's move on to the final research question. This involves analyzing the way students were using languages. I knew it was going to be hard. I suffered with this chapter, I'm not going to lie, because at the end of the day, it was very difficult to gather naturalistic data. Students knew that I was there. Students knew that they were being recorded. And that can be, of course, a limitation of my study. However, I tried my best. So I employed translanguaging theory, and I created a continuum in order to understand how they were using languages. This continuum was also informed by Bourdieu's notions of legitimacy and censorship and symbolic power of languages. So based on all those ideas, this continuum was created. As you can see, on the left-hand side, sorry, I'm confusing all the time left and right, but anyway, on the left-hand side, we can have language separation, and on the other side of the continuum, we would have a fluid shift of languages. And in between, we would have direct translation between languages, using a word or phrase in the frame of a different language, and finally, creative use of languages. And that is interesting. I will show you an example, because kids nowadays, it's amazing the imagination that they can have when trying to engage in conversation. Key findings show that students engaged in language separation whenever they needed to give a short answer. So, if the teacher was asking them something in Basque, they were trying their best to answer in Basque, but the answer had to be a 2 or 3 word answer. If the answer was longer or they needed to give explanations, talk about past experiences, that is when students moved between the languages, the resources they had in their repertoire. Students were using Basque for meaningful purposes and communication goals. So if they had to complain, ask for help, shout something out there, they would use Basque. Students are smart. As for teachers, they were using recast strategies a lot of times because they really wanted to keep the conversation going in Basque. So they were trying to police and control the use of Basque, especially in Basque lessons, but in content lessons, they were much more flexible with the use of languages. Language fluidity was also perceived in English lessons, but again, only there was a certain type of multilingualism legitimized in these lessons. Students were also advocating for more flexibility in the way they were speaking because they believed that translating between different languages could help them with understanding the content better. There were some instances of Basque policing, so whenever they were working in groups and migrant students were placed with local students, there were some students telling them, speak in Basque, speak in Basque. So that is what I mean by policing. However, during group work and also in the playground, I must say that Spanish was very present in the way students were communicating, and no instance of home language other than Spanish was observed in these recordings. And now I have brought here 2 excerpts. So the first one is from a science lesson at Mendia Escola. All the instances in blue are in Basque, and the instances in orange are in Spanish. So, as you can see, the teacher is asking an open-ended question. The teacher is all the time constantly using Basque. And let's see how Nasheed, who was born in Morocco and then came to the Basque country, uses languages. So as you can see, in her answer, she starts using Spanish. Al lado de mi casa, egun batean. So she's constantly switching between languages. And that is why I was talking about that original way of students using the language. If you look at quejatzen, the queja is a Spanish root. However, the student linked and used the Basque suffix. So the student was really trying to sound Basque, even though, if we analyze it better, there are 2 languages in place there. This might be the reason why the teacher does not correct the student. The teacher just keeps talking. The teacher just wants communication with the student, and the student really keeps using Basque in the following interactions with the teacher. If we look at this second excerpt, which is from Ari, who comes from, her family comes from Ecuador. This was a group work, so Ari was working with 2 local classmates. As you can see, the classmate is asking her something in Basque, and Ari is constantly using Spanish. Constantly. However, in the interaction number 3, she uses Basque. What is she asking here? Irakasle, begira zer egin duen. So Ari was complaining. So she uses Basque to call her teacher's attention. Once she has the attention, she switches back to Spanish. And all her the rest of the interactions were conducted in Spanish. So as you can see, different ways of communicating between students. So now, these are the main discussion points that I wanted to bring to the talk. And these are based on trying to answering the overarching research question of the study. So how are students' language practices in language and content area classrooms mediated by their perceptions of language and the expectations of parents and teachers? So here I was trying to put all the information together, and I realized that there were 3 main scenarios which were impacting the way students use languages and their perception towards it. Whenever there was an alignment between teachers and parents' beliefs, and there was a complementary goal with languages, students experienced balanced multilingualism. They could also have that link to that strong cultural belonging and also a high linguistic competence. This flexible alignment allows heritage and Basque language use to coexist. It wasn't one or the other. And this was seen in students such as Andrei. Andrei was the Romanian student. In this case, at home, Andrei was able to use Spanish and Basque together with his home language, Romanian. And in class, Andrei knew that he needed to use Basque. All the instances that I recorded from this student were conducted in Basque. So it was quite appealing. And that is because this student did not feel any tension. He knew that he needed to use certain languages in a given context and other languages in a given context. And there was not a misalignment, which is different from the second scenario, where there is a misalignment and tension arises. So when parents and teachers have divergent expectations, for example, teachers enforcing a strict Basque immersion and parents believing that that is a disadvantage for their children, that is when this tension is created. Students feel uncertain and they feel hesitant to use Basque and even insecure to use Basque. And this reflects and mirrors the tension that parents have at home. So in these cases, and as we could see with the previous excerpt, the Spanish-infused linguistic choices of the students. And this happened especially with students speaking Spanish at home. Finally, when teachers and parents' views were or supported multilingual integration, teachers accommodated the students' linguistic resources with selective translanguaging, and parents promoted multilingualism, either by sending their kids to after-school lessons, robotics in Basque, Zumba in Basque. They would also send students to Arabic lessons in the weekend. Some of the parents could also afford sending their kids to English lessons, so they were really happy with promoting multilingualism among their children. And these children were the ones who shifted more between languages during the observations. So that leads me to finally, and I'm sorry, but this is the last stage of the talk, and this was the big question here. What can be done? So, if the goal is to cultivate environments where linguistic plurality is normalized and pedagogical translanguaging is sustainable, placing, of course, the use and knowledge of Basque at the core, then what can be done? And this is the question that after analyzing all the data, I still had. So the study came, I decided to suggest some implications addressing different stakeholders. The first one, school leaders. I believe that there needs to be support to empower teachers, provide clear guidance and professional development training opportunities to help teachers balance policy demands with classroom needs and realities, because this is a reality. Classrooms are becoming more and more heterogeneous, and teachers need help with that. There needs to be spaces created, such as focus groups, networking events for teachers to openly discuss the challenges, not of course the success as well, but also the challenges, and not be afraid to share those challenges, because whenever they engage in debate, good ideas can come up. Encouraging critical reflection on language ideologies and also the inherent bias in regards to linguistic hierarchies that exist. There needs to be a move from language knowledge to active language use as well. And of course, this is a call on institutional and administrative support, as we all know. Whenever we are establishing realistic, context-sensitive expectations for the learning and teaching of Basque, this needs to be context-aware. So if we need our children to learn Basque, this needs to be realistic and taking the holistic picture, because it is not just local students. There are more and more students from migrant backgrounds who are attending this model, and therefore this needs to be realistic. And finally, we need to foster whole school multilingual strategies. For example, we could improve the linguistic landscape of schools where different home languages are visible. And that is as simple as placing posters or having a song in a different language in class. Whenever students feel seen and heard, this can also, I believe, this can also motivate them towards the learning of Basque, which is at the interest of everyone. And this could also go with moving away from assimilationist and segregation to more inclusive practices. Teachers, what are the implications for teachers? As teachers, we need to know and value students' linguistic repertoires. We need that background information about students who just arrived in the Basque Country. This can be done, for example, with a simple activity as the identity text that I showed you before, an activity where students can place the languages they know in an empty silhouette or create a language map. That can give a lot of information to the teacher. And in that co-creation, this can also encourage students to explore and share their own language practices, and that can foster communication between teachers and students. One of the interventions that could be done would be sustainable pedagogical translanguaging to normalize multilingualism and support minority and home languages while ensuring that breathing space for Basque, and integrating student linguistic repertoires can also enhance metalinguistic and cross-linguistic awareness, as has been studied already in works like Arraiza. And finally, there are a lot of tools, and I didn't know about this, but doing the research, of course, I realized that there are so many open resources for practitioners. For example, the Framework of Reference for Pluralistic Approaches to Language and Cultures, conducted by the European Council. This is a big database with a lot of material that could be used for that. And finally, and this is the last slide, what are the implications for families? First of all, I believe there needs to be a bridge between home and school. Home and school are no longer separate domains. We need to strengthen that connection. And this can be done, for example, by building trust, and teachers can get that open dialogue with these families, newcoming families, for example, by asking them to fill out a form where they can talk about the languages that they know, the languages that they use at home. That information can be valuable for teachers, and that conversation can start from there. We also need to parental involvement to increase, and this can be done by organizing afternoon events or after school events, multilingual reading events or celebrations or cultural celebrations or cooking events. But of course, here, it cannot just be one way. It needs to be a two-side commitment to this type of events. And of course, this can also encourage dialogue and help and peer networks between local and migrant families, which I think is essential because they can also learn from each other. And find mediating spaces for this connection to happen. For example, local libraries could be very good. And also, again, this is another resource from the European Council, the Involving Parents in Plurilingual and Intercultural Education. It's a guide with a lot of resources and recommendations in order to foster this collaboration between home and school. So, of course, I'm aware of the limitations and future directions of my study. I hope that in the future I can maybe try to analyze bigger schools, maybe urban schools, maybe in a different territory in the back or Iparralde, or maybe in a different international context. The purpose is also to, in the future, I hope I can also analyze the way these students use language at home. But of course, in order to achieve that, I would need help from translators, family, or policymakers. I mean, there needs to be a collaboration, but it would be very interesting for me to also see how they communicate in the more informal setting, not just in school. And again, these are some ideas. If you have any other ideas for further directions or further action that needs to be taken, I would be very happy to hear. And so this was the end of my talk, and now I would be very interested in getting to know if you found any similarities with the Welsh immersion program, if you feel that, if anything of the presentation resonated with how things happen in Wales. And so that was all. Thank you so much for your attention. Diolch, eskerrik asko.